Let's start out by looking at a fairly simple GUI like this. If we think of these widgets as objects, we've already got a bunch of classes to write. Label, text box, combo box, checkbox, and button. That's a lot of work before we can even get our GUI on the screen, so there's a library of pre-built widgets we can use called Swing. Actually, there are a handful of libraries. I do want to mention JavaFX, which is a newer and really better library than Swing. We're not going to use it because it does require a little installation and configuration that I don't want to make students deal with, especially if they're new to programming. And we're using Swing to show fundamental concepts, which will transition over to JavaFX if you want to explore that later. In Swing, every widget needs to be a part of a hierarchy of containers. Before we can put a menu bar at the top and start putting widgets into the content pane, we have to create a top-level container. In most cases, that's going to be a JFrame. JFrame will have some additional uses for us later on, but for now we can just think of it as something we need to put in place to hold all of our widgets. Let's take a look at pretty much the most basic Swing program we can make. We'll need to import the Swing package so we have access to all that widgety goodness, so don't forget that. Notice that Swing is considered an extension to Java, so it's import javax.swing rather than java.swing. Inside our main method, we'll start by declaring and instantiating a JFrame object, which we'll just call frame. In the JFrame constructor call, we can pass in the title of the window, and that will be displayed at the top. Next, we'll set the size of the window, which here is 300 pixels wide and 150 pixels high. Last but not least, we need to display our amazing window. Instantiating a JFrame object doesn't display it on the screen. We can use the setVisible method to do that. And it's looking pretty good. It's looking pretty boring. There's not much to it, but it is running. Notice though that it's actually running as a separate program. You can see the little Java icon up here. And if I click on the red X or the red dot, depending on your operating system, it hides the window, but it doesn't actually stop the program from running anymore. I can take care of that easily enough by killing the terminal in VS Code or by clicking the stop button, so this isn't a big deal. But we do need to understand that that is the default behavior for a JFrame, because often a program will open a different window once the user closes the one they're working with. We can change that behavior to cause it to close the entire program using something called the default close operation on our JFrame object. So I'm going to call set default close operation, and what I have to pass in is something called an enumeration. So I'm going to type JFrame and get that dot, and now it's got a list of all these. They're basically like constants that are defined inside that JFrame class that we can use here. And so I want exit on close. That's the behavior I'm looking for. Let's try that out. So once again, I've got my GUI to appear, and this time if I close the red X, it has stopped the entire program from running. I can see I don't have those controls up here anymore, and that icon is no longer in my taskbar. Once we have a JFrame in place and have set up how we want it to look and behave, we can start adding our widgets. The obvious place to start is to display some text. I know it kind of defeats the purpose here, but sometimes a GUI still needs to display some text. In a GUI, we usually display text using a label, which is implemented with the JLabel class in Swing. When we start creating widgets, we need to be thoughtful about how we name them. GUIs can end up having a lot of different widgets, and when we're writing code that references them, it's easy to get confused. Unlike most other things in Java, there's no prescribed naming convention, but there are a couple common approaches, and what they all have in common is that you need to describe the widget's purpose in the GUI. One convention is to prefix the name with an abbreviation that indicates the widget type, so LBL, hello, for a label that says hello. The prefix for a text box might be txt, btn for a button, and so on. I tend to do it this way because it's common in C# and I've spent a lot of time in that. Other people append the widget type on the end, but they usually don't abbreviate it, so you'd have hello label. And some psychopaths don't indicate the widget type at all. Hey, it's your funeral. We'll want to get this JLabel into our frame before we make the frame visible. Otherwise, we'll need to force the frame to render the window again. So I'll make some space here, and I'll instantiate a JLabel. I'll call it LBL hello. And this is pretty straightforward. The constructor call I make is going to accept the text that I want to display. So I'll say hello world because that's how I always start these kinds of things. At this point, the object exists in memory, but it isn't part of our GUI. We need to put it into our frame using the add method. Frame.add, and just pass in the name of the widget. And let's give that a shot. Okay, now I know what you might be thinking. This isn't that big of a deal. It's not that hard. This guy could have taught us this a long time ago instead of making us spend so much time on those boring text-based programs. Well, not so fast. Let's go ahead and add another label. So JLabel, I'll call this one LBL greeting equals new JLabel. And for this one, I'll say welcome to my amazing GUI. And don't forget, which I often do, to add on that new label into our frame. And let's take a look at that. It's not working like we hoped. If we want to add multiple widgets to a frame, I have to tell it how to organize everything. It uses something that's called a layout manager, and there are a handful of different choices. The easiest one is called FlowLayout. So let's go up here where we're kind of first setting up our frame, and let's use the set layout method. Now what this accepts when I'm doing my parameters here, it has to be something, a subclass of something called layout manager. And the one we want, like I said, is a flow layout. So I'm going to put new because we have to make an object. Flow layout and parentheses because there's a constructor call in there. Now VS Code is not recognizing this. The layout managers are not part of Swing. They are part of something called AWT, which is way beyond what I want to get into right now, but I do have to import that, java.awt.star, and that gives us our layout managers. It gives us some colors and some other things that we'll use kind of along the way. Let's go ahead and try running that. Okay, so both labels got displayed, but it's just kind of jammed them together. Let's go back to the code and let's try making that second label a little bit longer. That takes up a lot of space. And let's try running it now. This might make it a little more clear what is happening because you can see that it's put that second label on the next line down. Incidentally, it's also too big to fit completely, so it centers it and it kind of crops the edges. What a flow layout does is a lot like the way a word processor behaves. It goes to the top left and it starts adding widgets from left to right, and then when it gets to the right hand side and runs out of room, it just goes down to the next line and continues from there. This isn't necessarily the behavior we want, but it lets us get one more widget on the screen for now. As I said in a previous video, there's a reason we start out using printline statements. Look at how much code it takes us just to get a couple of lines of text on the screen in a way that doesn't even look great. And it doesn't even do anything interactive yet. For that, we'll need to move on and learn about handling GUI events, which we'll do in the next video.